My name is Vardit Ringvald, and I am going to be the presenter. I guess, somebody else is going to be the presenter.
Go ahead.
I'll be the presenters and the moderator, and I'm currently the director of the School of Hebrew and a research professor at Middlebury College. It's part of the language school. And the topic of our session today is, and the goal of our panel today is to understand better if and how Hebrew can play a role in building and shaping identity. I would like to start by some opening remarks about the issue of identity, and I know that my colleagues here are going to elaborate more later on this topic. Bonnie Norton, who is a scholar in the area of second language acquisition and identity, or second language learning and identity, describes identity as follows, and I really like to quote what she says because I think it's innovative and an interesting perspective. She says that identity is the way a person defines his or her relationship to the world and how that relationship constructs across time and space, and how he or she understands the possibilities, and I would like to emphasize the idea of possibilities of his or her future, and I would like to emphasize it because of the context of Hebrew, because when we talk about identity, we always talk about Hebrew as relying on what the past, the moreshet, the heritage, and so forth, so she is focusing on the possibilities of the future. So this is a very, I love this definition because it's dynamic and it's inclusive and it offers many opportunities for many possibilities. And she also mentions what scholars in the field of second language acquisition agree about the condition that should happen if you really want to use the language as a tool for identity reinforcement. I'm not going to name all of these conditions, but I'm going to talk about three. In order for language to be used as building or constructing identity, you need first of all what we call language practice. It's when the language is used by members of the community. When they do it, they go through a process of self-discovery. Because when they speak, read, or write, when they have to retrieve the information in the target language, they are not only exchanging meaningful information with the members of the same community that use the same language, they're also organizing and reorganizing the sense of who they are and how they relate to this social world. And this, according to the scholars, this is identity constructions. So number one is language practice. Number two, it's what she calls culturals and materials gain. It's when a learner values the language or proficiency in the language that they are learning, and because it allows them to access cultural resources that then would give them a wider view of the world. And the ability to create social interaction in order to participate in the community practices. But in addition to this cultural gain, they also have what we call materials gain, because if you know another language, you can have a better job, a better career, and so forth. And the third conditions that, according to her, scholars agree that needs to happen in order to use language as to build or construct an identity is what she calls investment. And proficiency can happen only when there is willingness to invest in the process of identity formation through learning using the target language. Only by obtaining, and she's talking about desire, to invest and to commit to the language process, identity formation can happen. And she's not really talking about motivation. I want to study the language. It's also about how much I'm going beyond I want to study the language, how much I'm willing to invest in terms of commitment and to do that. So our panelists were asked to share their views and experience on how Hebrew can support the identity formation of members of our community. And we're talking about either Jews and American Israelis or Israeli American, who live in and between cultures in such a complex and global world. So please allow me to introduce each of the panelists, and then I will ask each of them to talk or present for between 3 to 5 minutes. I'm going to say only one sentence. I'm not going to fully introduce because each of them has a resume, big, and a lot of, we can talk a lot about what they do, but I will allow each of them to elaborate and add to their information. So I will start with Galia Albin next to me. She is a businesswoman. She is a Goodwill ambassador in the Keren HaYesod, philanthropic, and she can add more about her activities later on. We have Dr. Udi Sommer. He is associate professor in the Department of Political Science in Tel Aviv University. He's also a member of the Israeli, is that a young academy?
I'm still young.
For science, and also
it's
in
for
Israel.
under 70-year-olds, so as long as you're under 70.
And also Israel Institute Fellow at Columbia. Yeah. And next to Udi is Netta Avineri. She's assistant professor of TESOL and TFL at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. And next to Netta is Dr. Joyce Starr. She's the author of several books. One of them I'm just finished reading. It's called Kissing Through Glass, The Invisible Shield Between Americans and Israelis. So I would like you all to welcome our panelists. And I will start by asking each of them to share their views, opinions, experience related to the connection between language and identity, specifically Hebrew. Bevakasha.
I will start by, I always wondered why American Jews are struggling with who is a Jew, and they get upset every time the issue of who is a Jew, who is a Jew. For me, born, raised in Israel, it was always very obvious, but I always had this conflict, am I first an Israeli or am I first a Jew? So in order to clear my identity, I decided that I'm first of all Jewish. And that's where it had nothing to do with the language I speak. And then when I finished the army, I went to school in America, which was, in my generation, quite unusual. I went to Northwestern. And then all of a sudden I realized I'm Jewish, but I'm Israeli, I'm American. The American Jews didn't know how to accept me. And then I was accepted to teach in a Jewish school called Anshe Emet Day School. It's in, and this is how I paid the tuition of Northwestern at that time, but I was always the Israeli. I was never able to assimilate with my fellow Jewish Americans. I was very Israeli. So then I said, well, maybe my identity should be Israeli. What I would like to say is a person, his birthplace, wherever, the place he was born, the parents he was born to. My parents came from Vienna to Israel. They couldn't speak a word of Hebrew because it was so difficult for them. They spoke only German at home. And until today, I speak German because, as we said, between the age of 0 to 6, you catch a language. I've learned it today in the other panel, that our brain has certain cells that are dedicated to learn a new language when we're very young. So here I am. Many, many years later, when I take my own daughter to Berlin, all of a sudden she said, Mom, where is this German coming from? You didn't speak it for 40 years. I said, this was when I started my childhood. So our identity is really our birthright. I was born in Israel. You can take me to be in America or anywhere, but you can never take my Israeli identity from me. We are here at the IAC, and it's all very sensitive because usually Israelis who left Israel and started to build their own identity in America, we're always paranoid. Am I what and this? Unfortunately, they will always stay Israelis, even though they'll be in America and say, we're American Israelis. Yeah, this is your title, like your title is you're Jewish, your religion is Jewish, but you will always be Israelis. So as far as identity is concerned, I think with all the migration now in the world, the fact that I'm doing a huge project now of anthems, and I researched a little bit the issue of anthems, like Hatikva is the song of the Jewish people, and it's also the national anthem of the State of Israel. But this is just because we're Jewish. Only the Jewish religion has a song, unlike Christians or Muslims. So our identity as Jews is different because we are ערבים זה לזה, and we feel like ערבות הדדית, a common, איך אומרים ערבות הדדית in English? You know what ערבות הדדית is. So, but it doesn't matter where we live. We have a lot of French who come now and live in Israel. Are they French? No, they're Jewish, but they will not, even though they have Israeli citizenship now, and the Russian Israelis, somehow they stay a little Russian, they stay a little French, even though they're all Jewish. But me, or us who are Sabres, who were born and raised in Israel, I can be anywhere, I can speak English, I can try to speak like an American, but I will always be identified as Israeli. And I'm very proud of it. Thank you.
So, just to elaborate a little bit more, what I hear from you, Galia, is the fact that it's the language that you were born into and the fact that you used it, and you talked also about the fact that you were speaking the language. So the idea of practicing the language made it part of who you are in terms of your identity. Is that what you...
At the early stage of my life. If you're Turkish, even though you're driving now a cab in Germany, I'll say, where do you come from? Who are you? He'll say, I'm Turkish. He's not going to say, I'm German. He speaks German with a little accent, but he tells me, I always ask the cab drivers, where do you come from? And they never say, I'm from New York, they always say the birthplace because they're very clear with their identity. So here we are. This is why I'm first Jewish. Because when I travel, my daughter now lives in New York. So she's Jewish, and she's Israeli. She always stays Israeli, but she lives down she made relocation to New York. And I told her, no matter what you do, you will always stay Israeli. You will never become an American. That's how it is. And we should embrace it and be proud of who we are. Then Americans come to Israel, they make Aliyah, they want to be Israeli. They are Israelis, they have the law of return, they have Tudat Zehut, everything is good. But they're still Americans because this is where it started all. And just let go, feel happy with it. Don't come to who am I, where do I live? It doesn't matter where you live, it's who you are. So this is why we're very lucky. We can always say, hello, we're Jewish. So that's very clear.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Thanks, Galia. I thought I'll mention two things. I understand that this panel is a part of a series of panels that is some sorts of a soul-searching enterprise. Soul-searching enterprise, both at the level of the organization, so the IAC is looking for how to looking, for where it's going, what its main goals are, etc., especially as it relates to programs related to identity and language, etc. And also soul-searching at the level of the individuals in this room, me included. And I, just to make things more interesting, I'll take issue with what Galia just said. And I'm not sure that this issue of identity and language is as straightforward as one was mentioned here. And this is the reason why we're here, right? If it was that easy, it was that simple, I think things would have been easier. And I'll be more specific, and I'll talk about, and this is the first issue that I wanted to talk about, is a book that I wrote about 5 or 6 years ago that I think at least some of the people in this room read, which is about the place where it becomes complicated, which is the place where people become parents. Okay, so I agree with Galia that if you were born in Israel, or at least your birthplace is less important. The formative years of your identity, if the formative years of your identity were in Israel, then probably you know who you are in many ways. But if you live in this country and you raise your children here, then the experience, the parenting experience, of an immigrant in general, and an Israeli immigrant certainly in particular, is pretty complicated, right? So I see some of the younger faces, some of the younger heads nodding, some of the older heads nodding. I guess the younger ones are the kids of, the older ones are the parents of, okay? I won't go, there's a book, so I won't go into the entire book, but I'll mention just a couple of things, okay? One thing is the issue of language, okay? So the book is based on a series of a few dozen interviews with Israelis. These were in-depth interviews. So it turns out, all of us who have children could talk about our children for hours, right? But we're never asked about, or hardly ever asked about us, about our parenting experience. When I did do that, I asked people about their parenting experience, and they just wouldn't stop talking, okay? So I would meet people at 8 or 7 in the evening and would stay there until after midnight. And one of the major issues was language, okay? Language is a major challenge, and I think, everybody in this room, or everybody who ever had anything to do with Israelis in America, know how much weight, how much complexity there is related to this issue of language, okay? So parents want their kids to speak Hebrew, so they won't speak Hebrew. So they speak Hebrew, there's a one-way street, right? Or a two-way one-way street, right? You speak Hebrew and the kids answers in English, right? Or vice versa. And then they're sent to Israel for a few months for being exchange students. They come back, they speak Hebrew great, they forget it after a couple. There's a lot of weight put on this, on the language issue, okay? And that's related, and I think, and I totally agree with Galia on this point, is that, this is the core. In many ways, this is the core of our identity, right? This is how, once you have the language, you can understand art, you can understand culture, you can understand politics, you can read the media, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is, in a sense, a common ground for the formation of a community. And I think to a large extent, this is why the IAC puts so much emphasis on that, right? You have the keshet, kshatot, etc. I won't go into all the cases here, but obviously this is a very important element, okay? So this is one point that I wanted to mention, and the parenting experience, etc. And this is, I guess, something that we can get into more deeply later on. The other point, okay, is way more current. So my book was published in 2010, so that's ancient history, especially with the pace in which things have changed today. The other point is about identity politics and current American politics, and the kind of implications that it might have for organizations such as the IAC. So, identity politics, it's a big thing, has been a big thing for a while. But I think the rise of certain movements, such as the alt-right in the United States today, and the fact that, and I'm not trying to take positions here. I'm not trying to say that I'm in favor of either candidate, but it's clear that once a candidate of one of the two major parties in the United States endorses one way or another certain elements, okay, that could easily limit the freedom and the liberty of organizations such as the IAC, okay, who support a certain political identity to do their enterprise, okay, that might get a little complicated. I'll be more specific, okay? So under the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, as we all know, there's freedom of expression, there's all sorts of liberties related to the kind of enterprises that the IAC and many other organizations do, okay? And that's related to one's religion and one's identity, okay? That might sound like a science fiction, but, the entire electoral season has sounded like science fiction, right? And I think there should be some thought, okay, maybe in this room, maybe in the IAC in the future, maybe later on, how is the IAC going to deal with it? And I'll just give my point on that. I think that the IAC, beyond the issue of identity and language and all those things, there are some common values, okay, such as pluralism, okay, such as equality, things that are fundamental both to what being Jew means, what being Israeli means, and what being American means. And I think those common values, okay, are things that the IAC should think about how to promote and how to expand on in those politically tumultuous times that we're going into. So, thanks.
So, Udi, just to clarify what you've just said, there are 2 points. One is that because language is identity, you could see the relationship between parents and kids. Focusing on language, as the framework for understanding each other's identity. And when parents really suddenly understand that their Hebrew, the Hebrew of their kids is not going to be the same as theirs, there is some questioning about identity. So this is where you found in your book is the most, the relationship between language and identities. This conversation about whether my kids can or cannot speak Hebrew the same way I do. Can they understand the culture or not understand? So actually, when we talk in the IAC about when we would like to explore this hybrid identity, language became the first part of this discussion because through language we would understand better the issues that are raised in your solution about the future are interesting, and we will hear some comments later. So toda rabba. And Netta, please.
Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay. So my name is Netta Avineri, and I'm going to be talking with you about sort of some linguistics and anthropological concepts that can be useful for us. That's what your handout is about. I love handouts, so that's why I gave them to you. So, I would just ask you, first of all, to look at my name and just imagine, when you saw my name, how you thought I might sound, what you assumed, right? How you
Netta, this is what happened to me. I didn't know Netta, but
Right.
somebody said, you should call Netta Avineri. And the moment she picked up the phone and said, Shalom Netta, ma shlomech? And she said,
Yeah, right. And I
Slowly.
Can, right, and I can understand, and I can respond in some ways, right? But the assumptions that we make about each other, right, and then therefore what opens up, what doors close because of those kinds of assumptions is a lot of what my research is looking at, and it comes really from my own experiences. A lot of times when I meet someone who speaks Hebrew, they'll say to me, they'll ask me where I'm from, and I'll say, "Ani noladati be'Be'er Sheva." And we moved when I was 2 to the U.S., right? But usually, actually, I'll say, but, right? I'll say, but I moved, right? And really, now I say and, right? Because it's an additive model of identity. It isn't an either-or kind of an enterprise that either I was born in Israel or I grew up here. They're actually both true. And therefore, there's a more holistic view of who we are. So I'll just share with you some of the concepts that we have in linguistics and anthropology that can help us understand what we might think is particular to Hebrew, but is actually a common occurrence for immigrant communities all over the United States. So the first thing that you'll see has to do with some really interesting work on language and identity being done by scholars in linguistic anthropology. And they look, what Vardit was talking about, at the ways that language isn't who you are, it's what you do. So it shifts in terms of conceptualizing, your practices. What are you doing on a daily basis? What are you not doing? Who are you with? Who are you against? Who do you see as part of your group, and who do you see as other? That is really what makes up your identity. It isn't just I am this and I am not something else. So it also gets into ideologies, right? Our belief systems about language and other people, and how we perform our identities all the time. I have a short example that I mention on the page. When I first got here a couple days ago, I thought, well, I'm in a setting where I should probably use my Hebrew, right? I should probably push myself to speak Hebrew, because right now I can only speak with my mom when I feel like it. So I said, okay, well, I'll try to say, 3 when somebody asks me what level I need to go in the elevator, right? At least I can do that. And so I did that, and then they switched to English, right? I mean, they were speaking in Hebrew to their friends, and then because of literally the phoneme level, like the sound of how I said 3, they thought she doesn't know enough. We'll speak English to her, right? So those kinds of, in that moment, right, my identity was being constructed in a particular way, right? And then I went to services nearby, and I introduced myself to the rabbi, and he said, Naim Meod, right, because of my name, right? So my identity is totally situated by the people that I'm interacting with. It isn't something I just carry with me like a backpack all the time. It's part of my interactions with other people. So the idea that identity is dynamic, and that we really, in order to understand people's identities, we need to ask them how they conceptualize their own identities. That we don't put people in groups, right? We actually need to have a conversation to understand better how they conceptualize themselves. So the last point on this first little slide has to do with the idea that identity is about similarity and difference, right? The word identity means identical, right? It means same as someone else, right? But it's just as much about who we're like as who we're different from, right? And it also has to do with who we count as authentic and who we count as inauthentic, right? Who sounds like they're trying to be part of a group and who really truly is part of that group, right? And also who we consider, what language we consider to be legitimate or illegitimate forms of a particular language. So these are just kind of concepts we can use to frame our discussion. So the next little slide has to do with how we define community, right? So we have identity, how we define community. So the notion of communities of practice, so these are people that get together and they have some common goal. They have something that they all believe in and do together. So it focuses on what people are doing, but it also acknowledges that communities are not made up of people who are all the same as each other, right? So communities are about a collection of individuals, right? And therefore it recognizes like the people who are core members of a group and the people who are peripheral and the ways that language is a part of that, right? So even if you think like, if you do rollerblading on the weekends or something, and there's the person who knows the term for the skates or something, right? And those people are the core members, and then those who are sort of trying to be core members, but they're kind of on the periphery, right? And also this notion of language socialization, which is, it's not, when we're learning a language, when you think any time you've learned a language, whatever the language is for whatever purpose, the idea that language and culture are obviously being taught at the same time, right? You're not just learning the root of a word, you're also learning all of the complexity around that in terms of culture. So this allows us to connect things that seem very macro level, like big picture, to the day-to-day things that we're doing on a micro level. So to now talk about heritage languages, I think I've heard people talk a lot about Hebrew as a heritage language and that it's a language of heritage and sort of using this term. And there's actually a whole field called heritage languages that looks at immigrant, indigenous, and ancestral languages where, generally speaking, English is the dominant language, right? So Spanish, Chinese, Korean, American Indian languages, all of these languages who are struggling because there's a dominant language that's getting in the way of people's being able to continue the language in their communities. And I think what's interesting for our discussion is who we count as a heritage speaker of Hebrew, right? Do we count people as heritage speakers because they learned Hebrew in the home? Do we count it because they have a connection to Hebrew in their heart, even if they don't speak it? Do we count those people who know how to greet someone and then switch to English, right? So the kind of broader definition might actually allow us to invite more people into the room as opposed to only defining people a particular way. So I just encourage us to think about that. Mm-hmm. So just a couple other things that are on the second page. So some different definitions of Hebrew users and their motivations. I'm sure many of you have heard the distinction native speaker and non-native speaker. We sort of use that a lot, right? Then thinking about who counts as a native speaker, who doesn't, right? So there's a really great scholar who talks about language users, right? That anybody who's using a language, right, whether they're totally fluent or know a few words, can be considered a user of that language, and we can sort of be more inclusive in that way. I talk in some of my other research about intergenerational motivations for learning languages, that it's not only about wanting to go to Israel, but it's about connecting with your grandma or something like that. And so just a couple other things, I know I'm running out of time, is something connected to what Vardit mentioned, which is the notion of a future self that speaks Hebrew. So that is in your mind as a motivation to move you forward. And there's a whole literature on sort of this notion of a future self. So just to go quickly, I have a couple other concepts that you can take a look at, and we can talk more if you're interested from my research on Yiddish, and also some more recent research I've been doing about how to cultivate your identity in different places. And the last slide just looks at what are the factors that are getting in the way of people wanting to learn Hebrew, right? One of them is that in the US, there are monolingual ideologies, right? That if you are going to be American, you speak English, that's it, end of story. A lot of immigrant communities. In the literature, America is called a linguistic graveyard because by the third generation, a lot of times children are not speaking the immigrant language, and that's not particular to Hebrew. And recognizing also that if we think that there's only one version of Hebrew that's correct and appropriate, then we're not allowing more people to get involved in the learning of it. So I just list here some of the challenges, like funding, meeting space, teaching materials, all of those things that we need to take a real hard look at to try to figure out a way forward for Hebrew. And I just end by saying that every immigrant community that wants to maintain its language, in the past 100 years in the United States, they have all needed kavanah. They've really, you have to, it's hard work in the US in a monolingual ideological situation. It's a uphill battle, right? And so it involves becoming a community of practice ourselves to say that this is something that we're focusing on together moving forward and using some of these concepts to try to bring more people into that community together. So thank you.
So, Netta, I'm not going to, I just want to mention two things, just to relate to two things that you said. One is in relation to the kavanah, which we talk about the investment that we're talking about. It's not the motivation I want to do, it's how much I'm willing really to put into the process, how much I want to really commit myself in terms of time and efforts. And the other thing is that I think it's very relevant to what we're trying to do here is to the notion that it's very inclusive, that it's not one thing for all, it's not one size fits all, there are opportunities in terms of the level of the language, the type of interaction, and the type of language even that we are speaking in this specific environment of a monolingual and ideological context. And more than that is the complexity of understanding what is identity in terms, specifically, like Udi said, in this context of this specific society, this specific world. So thank you, and Joyce?
This is literally the first time in my life that I've been the token American English speaker on any panel. I've had a very interesting life, which I don't have a chance to tell you about. But what I want to say to you today is that I really can't relate specifically to what has been said, because for me, what's most important is the language of memories. And at this conference in general, I haven't seen much discussion of the language of memories. And I'm not talking about the memories of, 3,000 or 5,000 years ago. I'm talking about the great state of Israel that came into existence and thrived and survived because of the giants of Israeli history. And now they're all gone. Paris is the last of them. He's the last of the giants. But you're not talking about them at this conference. And if you were to bring them up, somebody would say that's political. You can't say good things about Sharon or Begin or perhaps even Rabin, depending on where you're coming from. I want to explain to you that I had the privilege to be part of a generation, and there was a generation before me and maybe even one before that and some after me, for whom the language was not English or Hebrew. The language was Israel. Israel was in our hearts. And what happened to me is that I was working for a drug abuse group in Washington. I had a PhD by then. I wanted to go to Harvard to get an extra year that would give me another degree. Called up a sociologist I knew very well, very famous sociologist, for a recommendation, and his assistant said to me, he's very upset. And I said, what's he upset about? And he said, well, Israel's at war. It was the Yom Kippur War. And I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. He said, well, if you're so sorry, why don't you do something about it? Now in English, that has meaning. Why don't you do something about it? And it was the wake-up call to my brain, because we have a DNA. We have a heart, we have a DNA. It wakes us up. And I said, what can I do? And he said, you could volunteer. They need volunteers in Israel. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen, within 24 hours, I left my job. I resigned from my job. I had no money to speak of. Nobody did in those days. I had to borrow $1,500 or something of that nature from my parents to allow their daughter to go to a war zone, right? But they gave the money and they trusted because Israel was their language. They spoke it morning, noon, and night when the families gathered. There was never anything else. There was Israel. And off I went. Well, let me tell you, halfway, along with a lot of other young people who took that risk, and not one of them spoke Hebrew. They were all speaking Israel. And halfway across the ocean, there was a bomb threat. And we had to come all the way back to New York. And they said, look, you've been through a lot. You want to get off the plane? You want to go home? Not one of them, not one of us, went home. So we land in Israel. And of course, true Israeli style, there was chaos. Nobody was there to meet us. But finally they came. And they picked us up, and I traveled for hours, by now having no sleep for 2 or 3 days, and arrived at Sde-Boker, and it was the last days of Ben-Gurion, arrived at Sde-Boker and saw the most handsome Israeli I could imagine. I mean, I woke up, but it turned out he was an American. And he and his wife and his children had moved to Israel years before. Well, in the years that followed, many things came from that first visit to Israel, where I was picking olives and washing floors and dealing with all the chores and getting up at God knows 5 in the morning every day and going out to the fields. And the best months of my life, probably, if one has to look back, one of the best periods of my life. And I went on to become a Jewish woman on a political campaign, leading a Jewish division of a campaign, a Jewish woman in the White House, a Jewish woman leading the Near East program of a strategic think tank, and the first Jewish woman invited to Iraq by the Iraqi government, which we then, of course, took out later on, and one of the few Jewish women who ever took a taxi into Syria, and so on and so forth. First Jewish woman to go into Lebanon with the Israeli troops. Why would I go into Lebanon with the Israeli troops? I wasn't a legitimate journalist at that time. I didn't have journalist credentials. Because I wanted to be there. Because I wanted to support Israel. And I wasn't alone. Tens of thousands of American Jews went to Israel as volunteers during the wars. Went to Israel to live in Israel, Aliyah. But you don't know about us. You don't understand our hearts and what Israel meant to us. Today, you're trying to not build bridges to the Jewish community. You said last night you didn't have to build them because they're already there. But you don't know about us, and you don't know about those who, in the language of Israel, gave up so much. They gave up careers, they gave up money, and they wanted to be a part of something that was in their DNA. An Israeli friend of mine said to me, he said, Joyce, and he fought in the 48 war, and he was in the 67 and 73, and the first time he came to the United States was when he came as part of the military delegation for the peace talks, the Egyptian-Israeli peace talks. And he said, Joyce, I'm a Hebrew speaker, but I dream in English. And I thought about that, and I said, for me, it's not Hebrew, it's not English, it's Israel. It always was. And there were so many like me, and I wish you had known them, and now you probably won't know them because they're more or less disappearing or dissipating, or they just don't have the connection anymore for so many reasons. But the final thing I want to say, and as I said, I had so many things to say to you, but the final thing I want to say is the bottom line for me is something that was not mentioned here in this conference. Because I was in Israel in 73, because I was in Israel when Saddam Hussein was dropping those bombs in 91, because I was there and was in the gas mask, and because I was there at other times when Israel was in trouble, I know what it meant to Israelis to have Americans come. I know how lonely they felt when Americans didn't come. And when the bombs, the gas, well, what they thought was gas, was dropping, very few American delegations came. It was difficult. And even when they did come, and there was a few UJAs and others, but it was scary. I mean, Israel was being bombed. And now you saw the American government shut down the airway. I mean, the planes couldn't go. So let's say Israel was in deep, dire trouble. How would you get there if America closes down the airspace, right? But for me, the only language that matters for the long-term future, it's not the only one, but it matters most, is what will you do to support Israel if she's in trouble? Because that's the bottom line, that's the continuity that we all care about. And I think that wonderful life here, the camaraderie, the networking, but you have to be ready to go. And if you can't get there, that's a pretty big problem. I think, and it occurred to me as I watched your group last night, that you may be the front line. That the Israelis who live in America, as creative and as dedicated as they are, while American Jews kind of get a little bit further and further and further away from Israel, you may be the ones who are called to go, and you may be the ones who are the first to go. You may be the generation that got on those planes and went to Israel. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. And thank you for expanding the notion of what language is. And I'm glad we didn't call this Hebrew and identity, but language and identity. And thank you for talking about being so versed in this language and maybe giving us some food for thought in terms of what kind of language we need to prepare our children, even ourselves, to practice. And you did practice and you did invest in this. So it's like you fall within the parameters of language and identity.
Well,
so
the one thing I didn't mention, and I should, because you mentioned Kissing Through Glass, and I should tell you why I wrote that book. And the reason that I wrote Kissing Through Glass is because one day, and you won't remember it, Rabin talked about breaking the bones of Palestinians. It was a very important thing that happened in the United States. American Jews were hysterical, that he would speak about breaking the bones. And I was upset too, because I didn't want him to alienate Americans. And that's when I wrote the proposal and obtained a publishing contract to do Kissing Through Glass, and went on to interview hundreds of Israelis. And by the end, I understood. And Rabin said to me, I said, break the bones. I thought that they'd appreciate it. I said, I didn't say kill them. I didn't say kill them. I said only break their bones. And by the time I was done the book, which was, of course, focused on political leaders and everyday people, but my research has been on the great divide between Israeli leaders and American leaders, and how when they both speak English, they don't speak the same language. Mm-hmm. But let me tell you, there have been a number of Hebrew-speaking American Jews who've risen to the top of the pyramid in the White House and the State Department, and so they felt that they could, in some instances, trick the Israelis by knowing Hebrew when they shouldn't have known Hebrew, and therefore be able to listen in on conversations that were supposedly on the sidelines, but in many cases just participate in those conversations.
Yeah,
well, they both spoke Hebrew, but they didn't speak the same language.
Right. So participation is not enough. You have to understand each other. That's the key. So I don't know if one of the panelists would like to add something before we open it to a Q&A. Udi, I think you wanted to mention something?
No, I'd be interested to hear what people have to say. So.
All right. So let's start.
Hi, my name is Ella. I work for IAC Keshet and Keshetat. It's a program for, a lot of you have been in sessions with me already today, and you're like, oh, whatever. But it's a program for young kids that teaches Hebrew and also Hebrew for non-native speakers or the children of Americans. And Dr. Avineri, I wanted to see what I just did with your name. Sorry about that. that was really interesting to me. I think the issue of accent is something that we are always dealing with our kids. I have the sort of opposite thing that you have, where I pass as American, so I always get the like, so were your parents? And I'm like, no, I'm Israeli. I just and I have to convince people. But both with our, like the children of Israelis who don't have perfect Israeli accents for any number of reasons, and certainly our language learners who are coming into it and are sort of, especially as they get older, are noticing like, you're saying it different than I am. How to, and we go, limon, 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 limon. It's a tough thing, and I feel like it gives them the sense that they don't have the control of the language that they would like to when they're sort of confronted with like Israelis with an Israeli accent. So I'm wondering how can we sort of make them feel like, you know, that is not as important a part of understanding, speaking the language as they might perceive it to be.
Yeah, I mean, in some of the courses that I teach on like sociolinguistics, like connections between language and society, we talk a lot about this notion of accent and how it does position you in a particular way pretty much immediately in terms of your educational level, your regional background, all of those things. It might be interesting actually if you had a session with the students and the parents together talking about the notion of accent, because in my courses, at some point, the students realize, oh, wait, everybody has an accent. And it's actually not about the speaker, it's actually about the listener's perception of the speaker. That's actually what an accent is, right? It's not really about the details of the phonemes. It's about our perceptions of that person. And so I think having some kind of discussion about that, and even also providing to the students models of language that are not only the Israeli native speaker, potentially, right? If you give a range of different models for how the language can be used, they can, in movies, television shows, other things, and they recognize the language can be used in a fluent manner by a lot of different users. So I think being a little bit kind of like take a step back, have a discussion in English or in Hebrew, or both, with them about the notion of accent, and see where these sort of anxieties might be coming from. And then, also to give them models of language that come from a lot of different kinds of users of the language. It's the same, right? Exactly, right.
But Netta, how did you lose your Hebrew? I mean, you were born in Israel.
Right.
And you said it at the age of 2, and then everybody is mistaking you because you're not speaking Hebrew.
Right.
When did you lose the Hebrew in the process?
Right. I mean, I guess I would say I didn't ever lose it. I think I didn't ever have it. I guess, you know what I mean? Like, I suppose when I was in Israel, I was exposed to Hebrew all the time. We moved to California when I was 2 years old. My parents were speaking Hebrew to each other, so I have receptive knowledge. I'm able to understand a lot.
But they never spoke with you.
But with me, they didn't speak.
Big mistake.
And my siblings, those are my parents.
Those
You're
are
talking-
just, let's
Okay,
not have
yeah.
judgment.
Yeah, I mean, these are my parents we're talking about, right?
Really.
Okay, and I would like to add something in relation to, and Netta, you can, with regards to the notion of the accent. Sometimes accent is a decision made by the speaker in order to make a statement about their identity. And the question that we need to ask ourselves, how much and how can we let actually our students or our kids or whomever to make decisions about their identity using the accent as a tool. So this is another discussion, but make sure that this is not only the correctness. It's about a decision, a perception of who I am. And we know, in fact, that kids who can speak Hebrew with perfect accent when they're younger, when they come to, like middle school, they start to change their accent because they make decision about their identity. But we'll move on.
I want to add something just
sure.
briefly to what Vardit said. I can say that, so I was a professor here in a good university between 2007 and 2010. It's been 7 years and I'm a professor again at Columbia. I can say that one of the major things that I can see is that people use their accent almost as a political statement, okay? So you would have excellent students who would speak English, perfect English, with their, Latino or with Asian or whatever language they're using. So there's a political aspect to it, right? If you have an accent, supposedly you are inferior in a certain way, okay? If you speak Hebrew in an American accent, if you speak Hebrew in an Iraqi accent in Israel, I mean, there's the political aspects there as well. And I think kids are very sensitive to this political. I mean, they might not say you are politically inferior or superior to somebody else, but they know it, they sense it, okay? So if you can somehow neutralize that and say, not only that, but you can actually be a perfect speaker of the language, okay? I know some people at Columbia, trust me, they're top scholars, and they almost make a point of speaking English in their foreign accent. So that's another way.
Kissinger made a career out of it.
No, can I?
Okay, yeah, okay. We have the system of you have it?
Yeah.
So you're supposed to, it's your turn.
I just want to say to Dr. Avineri, I identify with you totally, since my name is Orna Shulman. My entire life, they speak Hebrew to me immediately. My Hebrew, I heard my parents speak it. It's not a judgment to judge my parents either, whether they taught it to us or they didn't. And I think some of the things about what Galia said about whether someone that can come to Israel or to any country for that matter and not feel more a part of that country, maybe they see that as home. There's a definition of home having to do with identity. There's a definition of what do they dream in. There's a definition of their slang. There's a definition of what they did their schooling in, that new adopted country can become more of a home and identity than where they came from. But that's a whole other thing. And then I just wanted to say to Udi that some of us are old that had parents that were Israelis and that didn't learn the language and now are picking it up later.
You're right.
So it's not just younger.
I actually thought about that when I said that, and so my oldest interviewees for the book moved to this country before the foundation of the State of Israel. So they moved here in 1947. And they, by the way, they too felt that Hebrew was their language, although, they lived the better part of their life outside of Israel. So.
Okay, Baksha.
Hi, I'm Dana. Also, same issue with the name, kind of Dana Gutman, and then I go to Israel and people are like, how are you American? Because you should be Israeli. I also know how much effort it takes for parents to make that decision and teach and have a child come out bilingual. My father is from Russia, and he made a very conscious effort to speak to me in Russian. I know many people who have two Russian parents and don't speak the language, and I happen to have barely any accent, even though I make many, many mistakes. So I know that it's not a mistake, but rather it has to be a very conscious decision on the parent's part to impart that. For Dr. Avineri, I have a question. I wanted to know if you could tell us more about the Middlebury program and like the summer program especially, or what was it? Oh, sorry, it was Galia.
That's okay.
I'm sorry.
You can
You
ask
all
Netta too.
communicate with me. So, so I just, whoever's from Middlebury, I want to know more about the program, how Hebrew came to be included among the languages that are offered, because it's not a given, and who comes to those programs, and why, because they're immersion programs.
So let me tie it into the identity issue. The program, I don't know if you know, but Middlebury is a program that it's considered to be the most prestigious program in terms of language teaching in the United States and beyond, and many programs would like to be included. And Hebrew was chosen to be included because of identity, because the president of Middlebury, whose name is Ron Leibovitz, decided that identity should be included as part of when you make a statement about identity, language should be included. So he felt that within the identity of the school, in which there is imbalance in terms of how languages are representing different identity, identity such as Israel or Hebrew or Jewishness was underrepresented. So this is why we were included. I'm being approached by many other language organizations and asked me, how did you make it into Middlebury? And I said, I did not. Middlebury made this choice because of the understanding of the connection between language and identity. It's more interesting is how identity happens when students are coming and being immersed, because they are actually fulfilling the three conditions. They are practicing the language, they know the value of the language, what they can gain from this in terms of their intellectual growth and emotional growth, and even in terms of their career choices, and also they are willing to invest in the language, and it goes back to what Netta said, investment. And I want to add a little bit more about your comment about your parents. parents need to understand how to invest in their kids. It's a science how to be what we call a bilingual parent. Actually, we give lessons. We teach parents to become bilingual parents because there is a way to do it, and I'm not going to elaborate it more, but if you want to hear about the program, there is more to talk later. So let's move on to Daraba. Yeah. And then
So,
Okay.
just one quick thing on the accents is it's not always conscious. And my husband he speaks English like an academic, but when he's speaking to his mother and in English to his Israeli mother, the accent turns on really thick.
Yeah.
Which speaks into the identity and choices you make.
Yeah. But what I wanted to ask is, you talked about the kavanah that you need and how the investment that you need, and any of you could address this, but Dr. Avineri, you made a list of all the different things, and you said that there has been some success in other languages.
Right.
I know we're different from many groups just because we're a really small minority in many places.
Right.
I don't know what the other languages are, but maybe you could talk about some successes and
Sure.
how we could
Right.
choose things?
Right. There's going to be a conference next weekend here in DC that's about community-based heritage language schools, where all of these different groups are coming together to talk about best practices for what works and what doesn't. And a lot of it has to do with, like I had the list on the last slide about providing community space, having support from the parents and and having teachers that are really trained. That's the biggest thing, really. Because in my research on Yiddish, a lot of it was somebody spoke Yiddish, and so they became a teacher of Yiddish, right? And then they're using really not very good language pedagogical methods for teaching the language. And I think that happens a lot, is that because you know a language that's not as commonly taught, you're therefore made into a teacher, right? So there are training programs online, all kinds of things. I could talk with you more about that. And I can give you the full citation for where all of these kinds of practices are being shared. But I think recognizing what we have in common with other immigrant languages may be a useful starting place, because there's a lot of really good practices being shared. So.
Hi, my name is Ben Cohen. I also grew up in the States to Israeli parents and spoke Hebrew at home. And one thing that I kind of noticed growing up was that since my Hebrew was maybe like 90% of the level of my English, but not quite perfect, I found myself sort of using like alternative methods when I spoke with my parents to try to get a message across. So like using hand motions or speaking with like different phrases than a native Israeli speaker would speak with. So I have a question for Dr. Sommer. When you interviewed those parents, did you find anything like that, where kids using sort of different ways or hand motions or nonverbal cues to communicate with their parents to make up for the loss, the difference with like between Hebrew and English?
So again, when I interviewed people, since we always talk about our kids, they took advantage of speaking just about themselves, okay? So you kids were not mentioned. You kids, you younger kids, or you older kids. But I can say later on I was invited to give several talks about the book, and then people came up to me and talks and workshops, so people did talk about other things. So I would say there's a range, okay? It's like a continuum, okay? So in some cases, the kids would speak, as I mentioned earlier, it would be a two-way, one-way street. When the kid would speak English, the parents would speak Hebrew, and that's it, okay? In other cases, maybe the kid would speak perfect Hebrew, and then it would be a proper two-way street where Hebrew is spoken both ways. And there's lots of shades of gray in between, okay? And I guess, what you're mentioning here is one of those shades of gray. So, that's definitely something that people talked about.
I took my kids once to dinner with an American family, and then after the dinner, the kids started to say, the Hamotzi, Baruch Atah Adonai, and my kids feel so embarrassed because they're Israelis. They don't even know the Hamotzi. And I said, Mom, what are they singing? I said, maybe they know how to sing, but you understand what the prayer means. So that's a little to show you that sometimes those little nuance of understanding the language or understanding the prayers being Jewish.
So there is another here, and then Rivka, you'll get there afterwards. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Danielle. I,
Can you speak louder?
I wondered whether, to what extent, you see the growth of the Israeli-American identity as being a limiting factor in this bridge building that is such a theme here at the conference with Americans. And I'm thinking, as I was part of a Brooklyn community for a number of years before moving to Israel, and the growth of the Israeli community led to a totally parallel structure within organized Judaism, within our synagogue, for example, of the Israeli Keshet programs or the this program, and the Israelis went to their programs and the Americans went to their programs. And as the Israeli-American identity rises and the immigrant need to maintain your own language strengthens, I found it to be a barrier between the ability of American Jews to enter the sort of world in which you inhabit. And their children didn't, in fact, join the linguistic programs. They stuck to their own and were alienated from your own emerging identity. So I wondered how you see that as a factor in sort of not building bridges in a way, but rather another factor in the sort of complication of the American Jewish and Israeli Jewish identity.
So I'm going to answer in 2 sentences because it's a huge topic, and I'm happy that you raised this topic, because if I put ahead of a person who is trying to build capacity in this country to make sure that we are going to have the best teachers, I see these Israeli American as a resource for those who might become the best Hebrew teachers, because they are gaining the language from a perspective that can be then passed on or contribute to those who are learning the language. So to pair what Israeli American can do in Hebrew and teach it to these, but through, of course, through professional tools, not necessarily as this is number one, but also to realize that Hebrew is not one thing. It's more than one thing. It's the Hebrew of the Israeli American, even, it's a variety of Hebrews, if I can say so. So, and expanding the definition of Hebrew will allow to be more inclusive. So everyone is allowed to enter this, like somebody mentioned it here, enter to this world of Hebrew and making choices about Hebrew and to be accepted as a Hebrew or as somebody who's using Hebrew at any level for constructing or shaping the identity.
Yeah.
So I hope that I'm...
And just briefly, I think, that if I go back to my second point from the very beginning, there might be some external forces that would make those two, what you call two separate structures or two semi-separate structures to work more closely together, especially if, the political atmosphere in this country is such that people will be, that people's identity, people's religion, people's language will become an issue based on which people are, vetted whether they're allowed in the country, vetted whether they're allowed into a certain political party, etc. This might bring closer together people who are identified as one and the same, being Israeli or Jewish. This kind of distinction may not be of major interest anymore. So I think that's another.
So to join forces is a reaction to working together. Sorry.
Can I just add one thing? Just to underscore what Vardit said, there's a whole literature on native-speaking teachers and non-native speaking teachers, and how students look at those teachers and whether they're considered authentic and everything. But a lot of times, students actually, if they're being taught by somebody who's fluent in the language and is more like them, they actually are more likely to learn the language, right? Because they see themselves in that person, right? As opposed to feeling like learning the language is so far away from me, I could never get to that fluency, right? So there's actually something to be said with having people who didn't learn the language be the teachers, and then, so that you can actually see yourself in your educators, so.
Rivka, and then we have another question, and then we'll do closing. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for this panel, because it kind of brought a range of ideas concerning language and identity. I'd like to have a clarification or get your opinion on another model of a student. I'm involved with the dual language charter school that 50% of its students are not Jewish nor come from Israeli homes. And when I describe or I talk about it, and people say, why would they want to learn Hebrew? And this is a question that I need to have an intelligent answer or assume, because I don't think that anybody made a survey, not that I'm aware of, to ask them, why do you send your kids to such a school? And something you said, Vardit, about making a decision about future identity, and the range all the way to what Joyce said about, it's not the language, it is something else, like maybe Israel. These students, the parents send them and they study Hebrew and they become proficient in Hebrew, and you ask yourself, what is what kind of identity they are forming? So I don't know if there is an answer. I don't know if there is any research in this area, and it will be really interesting to also understand that, because it is if it works with them, it should work also for people who already come with some kind of memory of,
and we definitely
heritage language.
Could think about it as a topic or a theme for the next session. Do you want to say something, Galia? And then there's
I'm
another
saying
question.
that Americans now are sending their kids to study Chinese, and why? Because it's more practical for their future. Hebrew, it's an emotional and it's pure identity. Studying Chinese in early age is when parents say, I'm building another future for you, economic future. So, exactly, so studying Hebrew, it has to do with identity and emotion.
The interruption is because as a startup nation, you teach your child into being more entrepreneurial, and take them away from gamers to learn something on the computer, and educate them at a young age when they're very, in their minds still being work. You can utilize Hebrew, which will help them cross culturally, will help them in their religion, and will help them if they work in the investment field, they work in technology, or they work in the...
And this is the materials gain that we spoke about. So we are short on time, but I would like to take two more questions, if possible. You and then another person over there was, I think you wanted to ask, no, somebody. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Yael, I'm from Boston, and I just want to talk about two things, or ask two things. One is about pronunciation, and my two kids go to Jewish day school, and they study Hebrew from an American...
Which one?
Cohen Hillel Academy, and there's a magnificent, wonderful woman, wonderful teacher, but she speaks in an American accent. Now, her purpose is to teach them how to read and write, and she does that beautifully. The problem is that they don't know how to pronounce the words. Now, Americans have a very big emphasis on pronunciation, thus every single school has a speech therapist throughout Israel, throughout the States. However, the Jewish day schools don't necessarily have a speech therapist in the schools to teach the kids how to speak. And I think that will be a wonderful tool to give. And something that I would like to ask you specifically about your school, if you do have that. And something else is, I think a great way to actually connect languages is to do between generations, is to take the grandparents that live in Israel to help the kids here and help the grandkids know how to pronounce, know how to speak, know how to read in Hebrew. And these are programs, and that's a resource that we should definitely use, and we don't use that enough, I think, as Israeli Americans.
So it takes a village. Netta, do you want to?
Yeah,
just shortly. And there is another question, and then if
Sure.
you're okay with this.
I guess I would say that we can first sort of ask ourselves why certain kinds of pronunciation are considered better than others. That would be a first thing to just kind of explore in our own selves. And also, I would say, speech therapy, it has a very particular view of how language should be used. And speech therapy is, it's therapy, right? It's the same as accent reduction or modification, where it's saying there's one way of speaking in the world. And from my vantage point, that's an interesting thing to explore and talk about, as opposed to saying that, oh, well, they're being exposed to the wrong Hebrew. If we actually start saying that there are various Hebrews and kind of pluralize it and recognize that they might be exposed to the language in other venues and recognizing all of the accents as we talked about, I personally feel like that's a more fruitful place than saying that the students must all speak the language a particular way. But that's my vantage point. So.
Thank you, Netta. And the last question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. My name is Dana. I'd like to say something regarding what Joyce said. And it's the question of, are we a religion? Are we a people? Are we a race? Are we a mishpacha? Whatever. And I just want to say that I was born to parents who were born in England, and they came to Israel as Olim many years ago. My husband was born to parents who were refugees, born in Poland. My parents considered themselves both English and Israeli. My husband's parents considered themselves first of all Israeli and then Polish. I grew up in Israel, came to America. I consider myself now an Israeli, American, Jewish. And my kids, some of them live in Israel, some of them live in America. The common thread between all of us, I think, is our Israeliness, is the fact that we belong to something, which is what Joyce said. We have something in common. We're a family, we're a people, all of that. And what amazes me always is wherever I go in the world, wherever you go, it'll be in the middle of Africa, you meet Jews, there's something in common. And I think that has nothing to do with the language. It has to do with the traditions, with the common history, with something in our DNA. So that's what I wanted to say.
So thank you for kind of doing our closing statement. So I want to thank our panelists and to you for being here. And as Yodit is here, so this is going to be continued, right? It's a huge discussion. תודה רבה.